Okay, so we're going to jump right in today. I want to talk a little bit about some MIDI fundamentals. This is something that uh, I'm really interested in. I do a lot with MIDI. I want to share as much as possible. And hopefully, as we're going, you'll have some questions. I think there's going to be a little bit of a delay from what I'm actually saying in the stream to when you actually leave a comment, and I can see your questions. But as you come in, I'll remind you a couple times, but definitely say hi down in the chat. And if you have any questions right off the bat, then put those in now so I can see them as we're going. We are going to be doing a lot of this, just basics of MIDI. This will be something I post later as well, so you can come back and watch it and get some more information about this. I'm expecting this will probably last 45 minutes to an hour. We'll see. We'll see how long things maintain here in terms of what we're doing. Yeah, so MIDI, first and foremost, is really interesting interface protocol, and that's because it's one of the older computer protocols that we use as musicians. It was released in 1983, so it's almost older than I am, but it's been around for a long time, and the old gear still works. In fact, today my controller is an SX-240, which was released, I think, in 1984, maybe. And it's one of the first keyboards that has MIDI capabilities on it. It's actually super limited capabilities. It doesn't have velocity sensitive keys, but the synthesizer wouldn't have had those anyway. It's a synthesizer with MIDI. So it has a full synth engine. It's a subtractive synth, and it just happens to have MIDI output. So I can put it into a MIDI interface and then into Logic and use that as control. And it has a pitch bend on it. Let's see if I can do this. Decent little knob. It doesn't even have a mod wheel, but overall, pretty cool instrument. If you want to see what that looks like, just pop over to the internet and do a search for KAWAI SX-240. I don't have a camera set up on it right now, but it just shows that even stuff that came out when the original MIDI was invented still works and still functional. And so that's what we're going to be using as my main controller, and it may come up a little bit later. We'll see. Now, with MIDI is one of those tools that we use every day, which is very functional and can do quite a bit of things, but it can also be the bane of your existence. We have over here our event list. This is part of Logic. I'm going to play just something recorded. Okay, so these are all the notes I just played. So this is our current representation of what MIDI looks like. It has the positional information, tells us when it starts, it tells us what status for the piece of data is. In this case, they're all notes. They don't have to be notes for this. You can have different types of status. What channel it's on, what note number it's on, what the value of that is. So you can see that this keyboard has a default value of 64 for the velocity. It doesn't have any actual velocity data. I don't know for sure, but my instincts say that probably if that may just be a default in Logic. I'm not 100% sure. But then the length of the note. I don't know if there's any additional data here or not. Let's pull this over. Yeah, so nothing in that additional category. Now we could come through each of these things. Probably the way you're more used to looking at this would be these little boxes. You can see that they correspond with each other. So this is a little longer. You can see that it has a longer, higher note value or higher data value for the length. But part of Logic is making it so we can see our data in such a way that is useful. For instance, a lot of early sequencers, we would have all of this numerical stuff. And now we've got visuals, and we can actually come through here with Logic and do things like collapse mode, which puts just the lanes that have notes in them. This is super useful for doing drum programming, by the way, or we can see all the available notes. We could look at this in terms of a score. So this is what, notationally speaking, my MIDI looks like. You can see we have a double note there. In the piano roll, that looks like that. So we're going to hit delete and just remove it. But we can now take all of this information and edit it just however we want. We can fix timing things. And you'll notice the score looks like it has no timing variances at all. But in here you can definitely see some notes start a little before the beats and some start after the beats. So the event list, good question. Right up here is just how you show it. And then you have event, you have markers, tempo, signature, but events is the one we're looking at first. And I know some old timers who still come through and create notes using the event list. So I just created that one by hitting the plus key. But you can also add other types of data here. So I could do like a, let's see, a pitch bend piece of data or a program change. I think program change, maybe one time I've used it up in here. I don't use it very often inside the actual event list. I'll look at the event list if I'm looking for something. And there are times that something is in here that you don't have easy access to see in our piano roll. And so I'll look here just to see if something else has changed. So down here, so we have that data. The other place we have instant access to data down here would be when we show and hide the automation. Now this used to be called something a little differently in previous versions of Logic, and now we're calling a lot of this stuff automation / MIDI. So it's not exactly one or the other, but it could be both to a certain extent. For instance, when I click to show which type of data we're looking at, I can come through here and choose volume. And this is not going to be part of our MIDI region. This is going to be part of our track or our, well, it could be part of the region, but it's not going to be per se MIDI data in terms of the MIDI spec. It'll be automation. You can see it has region automation, or we can switch it here to track. So this will go inside the MIDI file itself, but this one will go into the track outside of it. We're jumping ahead a little bit. So this is another place we're going to look at data here in a few minutes. With the actual MIDI though, we can come through with some of our tools. So we have velocity tool, and we can click on these notes and we can go all the way to the full value or all the way down. Now it's interesting, it doesn't let us go to 0 or 128, but we have 128 possible note or data variances there. So we can actually go between, 128 steps of data resolution really. Now, I don't really use the velocity tool very often with MIDI, even though this is how we can make it louder and softer. One of the things I'm doing is coming in here to the automation MIDI, and I'll come to note velocity, and it gives me this view right here. And then with this tool, I can do things like create easy changes to our data. So I have that tool. I could also use our pencil tool to do a similar thing. I don't know if there's one. Let's see. I don't think, let's see if the brush, no, the brush tool does the same thing. So it looks like it's all lines. I feel like you used to be able to actually draw different shapes in with that, but I'm not seeing it right here. I don't think those ones just do the same thing. But you can do sweeping changes. This is useful, say if you have like a drum part and you have a snare drum fill, you could have it build over time. Or you could easily make a bunch of changes there to sections. So we can change our velocity using these tools pretty easily. And that allows us to get exactly the sound we want. This isn't going to sound like anything. So in reality, I might be doing this, or probably a little bit less steep, up to the high note, and then having the other one be low. That's a little too low. We could even have that go down a little bit there. Or we could just use the arrow, the pointer tool, and move some of these individually too. So we can get the exact performance we want. Okay, so MIDI, we get to control when the note starts and stops, the velocity of it. We have a bunch of other data that comes with MIDI. And these are different controllers. Well, we have some basic ones first. We have the things like sustain, and we have pitch bend. Both of these are commonly built into keyboards, so you have a sustain pedal, and we could also be doing pitch bend with a pitch wheel. So for instance, on my keyboard here, I'm going to see, I don't actually know if this original keyboard sends out the pitch bend. I think it does because I was hearing it, but let's just record a note here. Let's see. Yeah, you can see all the pitch bend data that just got recorded into my events list. Coming down, you can see it right here as well. So that's all the pitch bend that I just recorded from the pitch bend on the keyboard. So it wasn't something that magically I had to have. It's just built into that specific keyboard, and most keyboards have a pitch wheel built into it. Cool. So then we have other control things. And some instruments like this Studio Strings in Logic, allow us to control parts of it with other MIDI controllers. So we have dynamics. We're going to turn dynamics on. And down in the expanded area, dynamic controller, I'm going to use general number 1. So this is the full list. Just like we were talking about a few minutes ago about the number of velocity steps, this has 128 as well, 0 to 127. And I'm going to use 16. The reason why I'm using 16 isn't an accident. It's because I'm using this touche controller. I don't know if this is going to work. Looks like it's on and off. Might not have enough power. I have a passive bus right now. Yeah, it might not. Oh, bummer. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about this right this moment. We'll see in a minute if we want to do this. But this is a controller which I might use at various times, and it works with 4 different directions. You can push the front and push the back. You can go side to side. And it's an amazing controller. I love it with strings. I've done a video about this already, but it works on those 4 different general numbers. Let me plug this directly into the computer real quick. Probably worth showing. Overpowered that bus. Okay. Or it's a cable that's bad. We'll see. No, it's working now. Okay, so when I push this down in any of these directions, it's going to do different things. Now, this is really useful for this particular keyboard controller because it doesn't have velocity built into it. And now I can control this instrument's volume using this right here. So let's record one more thing. And it actually might be better to perform this one in monophonic mode. That turns it to 1 note at a time. It means I can't accidentally overlap. So you get tons of control. This keyboard by itself doesn't give you any control over velocity or volume that way. And so we really have to have something like this in order to get any kind of control. So MIDI does that. It allows us to have these other controllers, those 128 different control pieces coming into each of our instruments. This is what it looks like down here. So you can see Logic is showing me there's other control there. Pitch bend was the one we already did. Here's general number 1. This is what I use. Now you're going to see general number 3 and general number 4. Doesn't really have any. Now the reason why they're there, even though I didn't set it to control anything, is because that device sends out all 4 different axis points as I move it around. So it's going to send it even if it's not attached to something. So that's just part of it. It is generating it all the time. Okay, so that's notes on and off, velocity, all of these other control aspects. We can edit the data in various places, both here in the event list and in our piano roll / automation MIDI editor. All of that stuff is pretty straightforward. But then we also have other data here that we can control, or other places we can control the data. One of them is over in our inspector, and we have 2 different main windows. We have our track and our region. With the region, this is setting stuff for specific regions. So, for instance, if I mute this, the next one is not muted. They're individually controlled. But if I come down to the track and I do something down here like transposition, all of the things on the track are transposed. First region, second region, everything. So that's the difference between these two right here. This top one is just for individual selected regions. We actually have some more information here. And then we have the overall track. This is super useful in some ways because it gives us two levels of control of what's happening with our data. First one, with regions, we have our quantization. Quantization is an automatic control over our note timings. At least that's part of it. So for instance, I've got notes here. I'm going to set quantization to eighth notes, and you'll see all of the notes snap onto eighth note subdivision. Now I can come through here. We have strength right here. I'm going to click and reduce the strength. You'll see if I go down to 0 strength, it's like it originally was. Look at this note right here on the downbeat of bar 3. As I drag this up, it moves. So I can do 100% correction or all the way down to 0%. So that's pretty cool. Along with that, we also have the quantization range, flam, length, velocity. So I can actually change the velocity of things. Let's leave that at 0 for now. The length, so I can adjust the overall length of things in this time. I can adjust flams. I can adjust the range. So the range sets how much of a window it has to be within to get quantized. And if it's outside of the range, it won't be quantized. So we can also do what's called smart quantize. And smart quantization actually tries to maintain more natural sound. And so what you end up with is, if you're playing like a piano part or something, it's going to maybe maintain a little bit of the rolling of the notes. And so it's not going to give you an exact lockdown on that. It's going to it's just going to make some of the timing things a little bit more natural. Now, the rule about quantization is that you want to set it so that your choice of quantization matches the smallest subdivision in your music. So if you're doing like a tuba part or a bass part and it's doing half notes and that's the fastest thing it does, don't set it to 16th notes, set it to half notes, because that's the matches. It matches the subdivision of the part. Same thing with this. If you're doing 16th notes, then it's smarter to put it on 16th notes if you have those inside the music. I'm going to do the 8th notes. Makes it sound a little bit robotic, possibly, if you do it wrong, but it also can take a performance which wasn't that great and make it more accurate. Okay, so that was that one. We didn't have any of the other data from the controller. We have that in this one. That's the pitch bend. But we could add this other data to this. Let's move that down a little bit. And let's set this up here. I'm going to use this now to add it into that first part. Hear how that sounds completely different now? I just added a little bit of data to change the volume of that. That makes it a lot more useful and can create a lot more variety and just gives us an overall better sound of what's happening. It also took away from what the velocity was doing here. So it actually overrides the velocity in that one particular instrument, which is kind of cool. And I recorded that and it just merged right with the other MIDI. So that's probably a good time to come look at our preferences for recording. So right here, overlapping track recordings with MIDI, cycles turned off. That's the little yellow bar at the top. So it's going to merge the data. That means the first thing I recorded with the notes and the second thing I did with the Touche controller, those now get merged together because of this setting. I could have had to do different things. If the cycle is on, it will do take folders for MIDI. And if it's set to record with replace, then it will just erase the original and leave the new one. So this is how all of that is set up. I can change the actions of it. It's pretty simple, straightforward. So let's go a little bit deeper then with some of the MIDI stuff. And this is one of the interesting things about Logic. You'll notice I hooked up the Touche controller with a USB cable. I did that right in front of you. I've got my other keyboard going through a MIDI interface. That's fine. But they both went into the same channel. I didn't have to change any settings. And that is one of the greatest strengths and weaknesses of Logic's MIDI. So if we open up the environment, this is essentially like lifting up the hood on this. Let's pull this down. Yeah, so we'll spread that out just a little bit more. These are all my ports. You can see the Touche right here popped up. And we have, it looks like, I think I'm on the MIO DIN 1 for the other keyboard. Now I can tell specifically by adding a couple monitors. Here's monitor 1. So here's the Touche. I'm going to drag this into here. I'm going to touch it with my foot. And you'll see that there's stuff happening. And then let's do another one. This time I'm going to pick a random MIO, not the one I'm on. You'll see it's coming through, but nothing's going to the monitor. So let's delete that. I'm going to try the one I thought it was originally. That's IAC. So it's this one right here. And we got it. So that's the two different devices here. If I wanted this to go on to our sequencer, I could. In the old days, before we had MIDI effects, let's undo that. Just delete that one cable. We had to do a lot of our MIDI changes in here. So we had an arpeggiator. I would have to route. Oh, I guess I didn't need to do it that way. So let's do that one into here. So now you're not hearing an arpeggiator, and that's because that arpeggiator only works when the transport is engaged. So I had to push play. But if I push stop, it doesn't work anymore. And settings, you double clicked on it and you had to choose what you wanted for this here. How many octaves, what the length, what the resolution, the direction, all of that had to be set here. So you had to make arpeggiators here using all of these connections. But now, of course, we do things quite a bit differently. Let's delete. Oops, I don't want to delete all of that. This is such a pain. I don't miss this. I kind of miss it a little bit, but that's a different story. Now, of course, we have MIDI effects. And MIDI effects are in here. We have, for instance, an arpeggiator. This is as easy as it is to do what I just did. Oh, I think I have to do, I don't know, we've lost it all. Let's go back into here for 1 second. Okay, so that is working. Going into the, let's just turn off. Okay, we are going to reload our strings. That's not the right thing. Studio strings. Okay, so now we have these MIDI effects which allow us to control our data. So I showed you the environment just a few seconds ago. Now we have these things which are essentially environment bundles. All the things we could do in there just put into plugin format that we can put on all of our instrument channels. So I can come through and create complex patterns. I couldn't do this in the environment. And we could take the same thing we were doing a few minutes ago with our dynamics. We'll do 16 again. And I'm just pushing this lightly to change the volume. So now we've got all of this stuff happening to allow us to get the best performance we can, the most controlled performance, exactly what we're hearing to be sounding out there. So that's why we have a lot of these different MIDI effects. For those of you watching, there's a few of you right now, are there any MIDI effects that you're really interested in learning more about? Type it down in the comments, of course. I think we could go through a few of them, but I'm interested to see what it is that you all are interested now in learning more about. So just take a second. Because we could just go through all of them or a couple of them, my favorite ones. We did another live stream earlier in the week where we talked quite a bit about the modulator. And that, of course, is one of my favorites in terms of manipulating MIDI data. We have a chord trigger, which is kind of cool. We have the randomizer. the scripter. I'm trying to think. I probably will, unless anyone has already. I think my favorite one probably, in all honesty, the one that I wish I knew how to use more of. And let's switch instruments here. Let's go to a retro synth. I think we're going to look at the scripter for a second. Unfortunately, you have to know a little bit about scripting in order to use this one to its full capacity. It's one of my life goals to learn how to code. But we have a number of different things in here already. So for instance, we have a few different ones that make a lot of sense. We have a sequencer, which is kind of cool. Let me turn down the sound just a little bit in case that's too loud. So we can actually do things where we change how this works in here. We have all the things like an arpeggiator, but it's a sequencer that's a little closer to what we'd have with a synthesizer. So it's going to allow us to work more like a synthesizer. If we're using a guitar patch, this one has come in handy a few times. Let's pull up a guitar patch. Do you all know what patch merging is? Let me show you this one thing while I'm loading this up. As for the other question, I believe it's JavaScript. So if you know Java, you should be able to script. But with the patch merging down here, you get to it in this bottom left-hand corner. You can enable patch merging. These things here affect when you load patches. So if you've ever loaded a patch and it's created 2 or 3 different sends for reverbs, and you add another patch and it creates another 2 or 3 different sends, I just always turn this on in the bottom corner, turn off the sends, so that when I come through here, do acoustic guitar, it'll load the instrument, but it won't add any of the sends when I'm doing that. So pro tip right there. Let's do MIDI effect, scripter. So we have a guitar strummer. So you have single notes on the top. So it gives you a little bit more of a natural sounding guitar strum. So instead of just playing on the keyboard and then trying to get your strum right, you play one key in the bottom part of the range. And of course, you can change a lot of the different things here. So alternate down on new chords. So it's changing back and forth. That's actually pretty cool that you can do some of these things with it. There are a few others in here. There's a couple stutter things which are kind of cool. I don't think that's going to be set up right. Only the notes with an ID. So we'll look at that. Not right now. We can have that keep on going. So maybe a smaller number with a stutter, but a few more repeats. So you can kind of come up with some cool things that you couldn't do any other way inside Logic without just programming all the notes. So for sure, the potential for Scripter is huge. You can find some scripts online. You can import them, copy and paste them, etc. But they are available. Some people have made some other cool ones. It's not like the biggest thriving coding community in the world, but there's definitely a few out there that are pretty cool. In addition to that, I would say I use Arpeggiator probably the most. I just love the sound of the arpeggiator with a good instrument. So, for instance, retro synth and the arpeggiator probably work into every single one of my songs at some point. And not just the straight arpeggiator, but the pattern version. And some of these you can actually make into chords. Now, I've had a couple questions over the past few weeks about some of the data generated from MIDI effects. And so there's one thing I'm going to try right now. It's just something I've been thinking about, but I don't know if it's going to work or not. I want to actually see if I can record this data in, because right now what happens is that if we play this data, record it in, so it's not the arpeggiated data. This is my held out notes. And then they're just freshly arpeggiated every time that you put it through this effect. Yeah. So I'm trying to think of, one of the things I was thinking of was using the MIDI environment, and I'm not sure this is going to work or not. We're going to try it. And we want to do the MIDI instruments here, the mixer. So we have our instrument. This is the one with the retro synth on it. And I don't know if this is going to work. I'm going to try it real quick. I want to put a monitor here and send this out to it. And so that doesn't actually, you'll see it just does my same notes. So it doesn't actually do kind of what I was thinking of. One thing I'm going to do as well is, I wonder if, yeah, so we have a lot of different choices to experiment with this. I'm going to see, I have my IAC driver turned on. It would be kind of cool. So for instance, one option we have would be, let's make a new instrument track. For this one, we are going to do our audio effects. Let me try this one thing, and then I will look at the articulations in a second, because that's actually really useful as well. Let me show you this thing real quick. We're doing it under Instrument, External Instrument. The MIDI destination will be the IAC driver. Okay, And I think if we do the IAC driver as the output, the MIDI effects arpeggiator should work. And then, yeah, this is going to get a little, we'll see. I'm only going to spend another 60 seconds on this. I don't know if I can do sequencer physical input. Let's get rid of this thing right there. Physical input here. IAC driver is this one. I'm going to drag it into that second instrument. So we've just looped our MIDI outside. Here's our instrument. We're going to turn off the arpeggiator here. If I play this track, and if I go to the second track, because now this track is going, it's sending out the external instrument down the IAC driver, and then I set the IAC driver on the inputs. I just attached it to this first track. Now we should have that data recorded. We have to record both. Okay, let's do that again. So we want this one to be a recording. Let's see if this works. Okay, so that's still recording the original. I don't like how it does that. Let's there's something else here. Where is that? That's there's a place where project settings, recording, auto demix by channel if multi-track recording. That little thing there, I think is going to let us do this. Maybe not. Man, why is it not letting me do that? It's actually working. I'm missing some step here, I'm sure of it. Anyway, I'll have to figure this out. There's a way to do it. But right now it's not letting me do both. Okay, let's move on. I'll figure that out. I think that there's a way to do it so that we can record. It's letting me already send it. So why don't we do this? It's weird, it's not. Yeah, it's not registering that data. I'll have to figure it out. Okay, cool. So the articulations, this is something which is super useful now with some of the new instruments we have. So with our studio strings, for instance, or brass. Actually, let's switch over to brass. We already did the strings, the horns. So we have all of the articulations here, and we can switch between them. So we can go through and get a much different sound with all of them. One thing to think about is that if you load the instrument in the instrument slot, but you don't use the library, then not all of this articulation stuff gets set up correctly. So for instance, I just loaded it here. I have to go then up here to my track, and I need to load up my studio horns, trumpet, 1 articulation set. That's super useful because then we can actually use those. I think if we're coming over here and go straight into this section, then those will get loaded up automatically, or they should. Looks like it's still set to trumpet. Okay, so then if we're recording something with trombone, right? So we have this thing here. Now we can actually come through. Say we want to change these 4. Over on the side, we have articulation. So we could do marcato short, for instance. Or we could do staccato. We'll change that last one to be the marcato long. So we get slightly different sound with those. I think the first 2 here should probably... Let's do that. This one is marcato as well. So you can come through and change the performance at a level that other controls won't actually do much with. So we have the ability then, let's add some dynamics to this as well, using our favorite controller here. And again, let's just delete that. We're going to just record over. We don't have a cycle set, so it'll get merged. Oof. Not the best performance I've ever done, but it'll work. And so now we've got dynamics happening. Whoa. So let's actually change that. Let's use a pencil here and let's draw that a little bit better. They're already pretty loud just because the sample changed, so let's actually try on the soft side. That's a good starting place, and let's actually go louder though. Okay, so we have a lot of control over it there. I'll check out the MIDI effects freeze. Yeah, I think that this is the same, back to the other issue with their recording the MIDI. There was something about the way, if it's not actually getting MIDI data from the right place, although I feel like at some point I got that to work where we recorded it in, but it's so it's overly complicated in a stupid way, so the way that I'm doing it or trying to do it here didn't make much sense. But I am curious about that. I think I'll have to experiment with that when I'm not doing in the middle of a live stream. Cool. Articulation stuff doesn't just have to be with those. So there's some that come with the presets, but we could as well manufacture some of our own stuff, which is kind of cool. So load up an instrument. Back to this. Let me just show you the dialog at least. So we do a new one. And we can come through here and actually fine tune some of the stuff, changing the ID, the channel it's on, the symbol that gets used. And then with this, we can change some of the other things that happen with it. So for instance, articulation 1 type could change pitch bend or controllers or programs on off. So we could change quite a bit of stuff here with these particular switches. Mostly it's useful if you already have things set up like that, but it can be used in a number of different situations. Some of the older Logic instruments, say with the EXS-24, so let's see. If we were to use this to actually load up some of the old instruments, let's see, we have, well, this isn't one of the older ones, but let me check it out real quick. So inside this instrument, it is possible. I don't know if they're going to have different ones or not. Select group by. So these ones are selected by MIDI channel down here. They're not using the IDs, even though the if you want to program a new sampled instrument, you could program in the articulation component using this right here. So we could use the articulation thing, but a lot of them are not the older ones, so they're controlled in other ways, which is totally fine. But you just have to kind of be aware of which ones are which. Some of them are triggered by velocity. Some of them are triggered by the mod wheel. Some of them are triggered by articulation things, but you could shift all of the old ones over to using articulations by creating new sets. And then you can choose like what's the articulation do. It changes the continuous controller, which is what triggers the change in articulation in the instrument you're using. So, I mean, do we need to do that? It's probably going to take a long time to really do that well and get it all working, but it could be an interesting exercise in doing so. Cool. Any other questions? I think we're going to wrap up here because we've been going about an hour. And yeah, I think I'm probably going to get off and do something else. But if there's any last questions, let me know. And thanks for sticking with it, the couple of you who have been here. I'll be posting this up. I might edit out a little bit of the middle stuff, the parts that, like the failed environment